The German tanks after World War II. When the guns fell silent in 1945, thousands of German tanks stayed right where the war left them. Some were examined, some were reused, and most were erased. Their quiet afterlife exposes how fast military power can disappear once a war ends. The war officially ended in May 1945, yet much of Europe still looked unfinished, as if the fighting had paused rather than stopped. Roads led past burnt towns and shattered factories, and beside them stood German tanks that would never move again. Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs rested at odd angles, parked where crews last abandoned them, empty and unmanned. Many of these tanks were not lost in battle. Fuel shortages had taken hold long before the surrender, forcing crews to stop wherever the last drops ran out. Retreat happened faster than repairs. In some cases, German soldiers made sure the tanks could never be used again. Engines were ruined on purpose. Gearboxes were cracked open. Radios, optics, and useful parts were pulled out and carried away to keep other vehicles alive for a few more days. Allied troops entering Germany met a strange sight. Machines that once dominated battlefields now sat helpless, streaked with rust and dust. Some had sunk into soft ground. Others stood with hatches open, stripped bare and silent. These tanks had shaped years of fear and destruction. Now they looked small, almost forgotten. The war had ended, yet a hard question hung in the air. What happens to an army when its weapons are left behind? Late in 1945, priorities across Europe shifted. Cities lay in ruins, rail lines were broken, and millions of people needed homes and work. Military strength no longer mattered in the same way. Allied leaders reached a firm conclusion that Germany could never be allowed to gather weapons again. New orders made that position clear. German tanks were labeled prohibited equipment. They were not allowed to remain usable. Storage for future use was forbidden. Concealment was treated as a violation. Nearly every remaining vehicle now faced a single outcome. This decision closed the final chapter of Germany's wartime armored force. What followed was not a symbolic gesture or a limited cleanup. It became one of the largest and most deliberate disarmament efforts ever carried out, stretching across occupied Europe and touching every surviving piece of German armor. Scrapping began soon after, reaching full pace between 1946 and 1948. Rail lines and truck convoys carried tanks from depots and fields to steel plants across Germany and nearby regions. Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns arrived in long rows, waiting their turn. Workers cut through thick armor with torches and heavy tools. Hulls were broken apart piece by piece. Turrets were split open. Tracks were separated and stacked. The process was slow and noisy, yet methodical. Each tank disappeared in stages, reduced from a weapon into raw material. Security played a role, but necessity mattered just as much. Europe faced a serious steel shortage. Bridges needed rebuilding. Factories needed frames. Homes needed beams. Metal taken from tanks flowed straight into civilian projects. Armor plate that once faced enemy fire soon supported roofs, roads, and railways. Near the end of the 1940s, hundreds of German tanks had vanished completely. Photographs and paperwork became the only proof that many of them had ever existed. Some vehicles escaped the furnaces, though not for heroic reasons. Practical problems often led engineers to unexpected solutions. In several rural areas, abandoned tanks served as ready-made heavy objects that could not be easily moved. Damaged vehicles were pushed into riverbanks to slow erosion. Others were buried in quarries or unstable ground to prevent landslides. These tanks no longer served military purposes. They became weight and structure, pressed into the earth where no one expected to see them again. Time finished the job. Soil settled, grass grew, trees took root. In a few places, tanks disappeared so completely that memory faded with them. Years later, construction crews or floodwaters uncovered steel shapes buried beneath fields and river edges. Locals often stood in disbelief, staring at fragments of history that had been hidden in plain ground for decades. Many tanks escaped the cutting torch only to meet a different end. Military training grounds needed solid, realistic targets, and German armor provided exactly that. These vehicles were no longer weapons. They became test subjects. Old Panthers and Tigers were dragged onto firing ranges and set in place. Crews aimed new rounds at them to see what worked and what failed. Engineers watched closely, noting how shells struck thick armor, how plates cracked, and how internal damage spread. Each impact answered questions that paperwork could not. Once a tank was torn open and no longer useful, it stayed where it fell or was hauled away for scrap. These scarred hulls never appeared in victory parades or museums. Their role stayed quiet and unseen. Even so, they helped shape the next generation of weapons and ammunition, carrying lessons forward without ceremony. Elsewhere, the work was less controlled and far more widespread. Across Central and Eastern Europe, wrecked vehicles still blocked roads, sat in forests, or rested along old defensive lines. Clearing teams moved in to remove them. Fields needed plowing. Towns needed access. Rail routes had to reopen. Former research centers and factories faced the same fate. Half-built hulls, damaged prototypes, and experimental machines were dismantled piece by piece. Stories later surfaced about hidden depots and secret bunkers packed with intact tanks. Careful records and inspections tell a different story. Most of these machines were destroyed quickly, with little interest in preserving them. Near the end of the 1940s, intact German tanks had become rare. The fleet that once filled headlines and intelligence reports now existed only in fragments and memory. A smaller number of vehicles followed a different path. Several countries emerged from the war with limited armor and pressing security needs. German tanks filled those gaps, at least for a time. France put captured Panthers into service and valued their strong guns and clear sights. Maintenance soon became a problem. Breakdowns were common, and spare parts were scarce. Eastern European armies used German vehicles mainly for training while preparing to adopt newer equipment. Spain relied on Panzer IVs longer than most, keeping them active well into the post-war years. One of the most unexpected chapters unfolded far from Europe. Surplus Panzer IVs reached the Middle East and entered frontline service decades after their design. These tanks fought under new flags, in new climates, and in conflicts their builders never imagined. Their long journey from German factories to distant battlefields marked one of the final echoes of World War II armor. Time proved harder on these tanks than enemy fire. Spare parts became impossible to find. Repair manuals were lost, incomplete, or written for factories that no longer existed. Mechanics did what they could, mixing parts from different vehicles and relying on trial and error. Each fix lasted a little less than the last. By the middle of the 1950s, most German tanks still in service reached the end of their usefulness. Engines failed beyond repair. Gear systems wore out completely. Keeping them running demanded more effort than the tanks were worth. One by one, armies retired them, replacing them with newer and more reliable designs. A few vehicles escaped destruction. Museums stepped in, saving select examples to preserve the record of armored warfare. These survivors became teaching tools rather than weapons. Visitors could stand beside them and see the size, weight, and complexity of machines that once ruled battlefields. Their numbers stayed small, which made each preserved tank feel rare and personal. German tanks did not disappear without leaving a mark. Engineers studied their strong points and borrowed ideas that worked. Sloped armor, powerful guns, and advanced sights shaped later designs. Their failures mattered just as much. Complex systems and constant breakdowns taught planners that reliability and ease of repair mattered as much as firepower. Their story also carries a broader lesson. Military strength can vanish faster than expected. Weapons built with enormous effort and expense were dismantled, buried, or forgotten within a few short years. What once symbolized dominance became scrap, fill material, or silent exhibits behind museum walls. The German tank fleet did not drift into myth. It was taken apart piece by piece, melted down, reused, and scattered across continents. In the end, steel shaped for war found a quieter purpose, helping rebuild a broken world instead of tearing it apart. If this story held your attention, continue with our video on what happened to Germany's U-boats after the war. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for a clearer and grounded history. Thanks for watching.